everybody. I want to welcome everybody. We have a good crowd here today, and I think it should be an interesting discussion. I want to turn it over to our staff first to get us started with a couple preliminary messages.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Is this on? Chairman Glick, you're ready to start panel one? All right. Good morning and welcome to the New England Winter Gas Electric Forum. I would like to remind all participants to refrain from discussing the specific details of pending contested proceedings listed on the supplemental notices issued on October 22nd and September 6th, and to refrain from discussion of other pending contested FERC proceedings. If anyone engages in any of these discussions, we will interrupt the discussion to ask the speaker to please avoid that specific topic. And now I'd like to introduce our first panel. We have Mark Brown, Vice President of State Affairs, Consumer Energy Alliance; Charles Cruz, President and CEO of the Northeast Gas Association; Charles Dickerson, President and CEO of the Northeast Power Coordinating Council, or NPCC; Stephen George, Director, Operational Performance, Training and Integration, ISO New England; Tom Kaslow, Vice President, Market Policy, First Light Power; Rebecca Tepper, Chief of the Energy and Environment Bureau, Massachusetts Attorney General's Office; and Kimberly Watson, President, Interstate Gas Pipelines, Kinder Morgan. This panel will begin with two presentations. First, I would like to recognize Charles Dickerson of the Northeast Power Coordinating Council for his presentation. Charles, yes.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Before I begin my presentation, I would be remiss, being a former utility guy, to not start off with a safety message. So I just ask everyone in this room to identify the closest exit, identify the person sitting next to you, and if we have to evacuate, make certain that you find that exit, and if you don't see the person sitting next to you, let emergency responders know should they have been trapped in the building. And with that, I'll get into my presentation. So I've done a lot of testimony in my life over the years at the state level, and I hope you all will indulge me because whatever degree of success I've had in previous testimony has been based on me following a basic rubric to try to stick to the construct for which I'm testifying and to make my testimony as plain and simple as I possibly can. So I asked myself and I asked us, and it's a rhetorical question, collectively, why are we here? And the title of the forum says it's we're here to discuss and gain information about New England and the winter gas relationship, a gas and electric relationship specifically as it relates to the winter. And then I said, well, Charles, why are you here? And some of you may be asking this. As it was noted in the introduction, I am the CEO of the Northeast Power Coordinating Council. And it's difficult and almost impossible for me to discuss New England without the broader context of discussing the region, because New England is connected to the region, as we're now learning that gas is connected to electric. So I'm going to give a general regional overview, although my comments are going to be more specific to New England. I think it's important to give a regional overview. So if I follow the instructions carefully, I don't know if I'm advancing the slides or if someone from staff is advancing the slides, because they're not advancing. So if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. All right. So the Northeast Power Coordinating Council basically is one of 6 regional entities that work in conjunction with NERC to help ensure the sustained reliability, energy adequacy, and security of the continent's electric system, not just New England, not just the Northeast, not just the United States, but Canada and northern parts of Mexico as well. However, Northeast Power covers about 1.2 million miles. I'm not going to drain the slide, affecting over 56 million people, 7 states and multiple regions in Canada. You can go to the next slide. Where am I controlling it? It's hard for me to tell. This is an overview of the resource mix through the 2022 through 2030 period, either existing or expected to exist. I'm not going to drain this slide because I don't think this is the most germane part of the conversation, but it's included for your understanding. So let's talk about the current situation. The resource mix is changing in New England. It's changing in the country. But as it relates to this specific topic, there are coal and nuclear units return. There's an increased emphasis on wind and solar. There's some very aggressive And that's not a pejorative or an indictment, it's just the fact there's some very aggressive clean energy policy objectives in New England. And those are being accomplished or attempting to be accomplished through the construction and development of wind and solar. There's a significant desire to rely on battery storage, but I will tell you as a former operator, battery storage technology isn't where we need it to be at a utility scale. And by that, we do not have large enough batteries presently to replace a significant size generating unit. There's also a need for new transmission to connect the integrated offshore wind projects to the load centers. I will suggest to you respectfully that there's a need for a transition that we're going through. And in my comments in the context of the transition, neither Northeast Power nor NERC, and Jim Robb will speak to this later, are against the end state that we're trying to achieve from a renewable perspective. But as we are moving from where we are now and evolving toward that end state, there's a significant need to make certain that we have bridging technologies or retain the technologies that will help us deal with that. And I'm going to pause real quickly to kind of put this in as plain language as possible. And I hope by doing so I'm not offending anyone, because I know most of the people know this, but I don't think that we say it as plainly enough. At the end of the day, while this industry and the provision of electric service can be complicated from a physics perspective, overall, it's basically kind of simple. Electricity, for the most part, cannot be stored like water or gas. We have to make it when it's needed, and we have to keep the demand and the supply in balance. Hence, we have terms like balancing authorities. Whenever the demand exceeds the supply, there are only two basic tools that we have in our toolkit. We can either increase the supply to meet the demand, or we can reduce the demand to come down to what's the supply. Now, there are all types of variations of that with demand response and curtailing, but at the end of the day, what we're doing is either increasing supply to meet demand or reducing demand to match the supply. The supply part, for the most part, since this industry has been founded, has been managed through what we call dispatchable resources, generation that we can change, because even as I'm speaking to you right now, demand on the system is changing. Somebody is flicking a light on or off. If we do nothing in this room but sit still and 3 more people enter the room, it's going to increase the temperature of the room, so the air conditioner may kick in and kick off. The way we manage that is through dispatchable load. Now, there's a great contribution come from renewables, but as we all know, we cannot control when the wind blows or when the sun shines. So even on the most sunny days, there can be cloud cover. And if that cloud cover covers solar panels, it's going to create a delta between the output and what's required. And what we do as an industry, what I'm responsible for doing is making certain that the transmission owners and operators and generation owners and operators have the adequate tools they need to close that gap. We cannot control the sun or the wind, and the tools that we use right now are dispatchable generation. Because there's a retirement of coal in the region, the technology that we're most relying upon and that we're going to have to be relying upon to make it plain is a gas-type technology, natural gas. The problem in New England is in the wintertime, there are only but so many gas pipes feeding natural gas into the New England area, and those gas pipes can be constrained. They're going to be constrained for 2 reasons. One, they're going to be constrained because of the physics. There's nothing we could do. The pipe is only but so big, no matter how big we make it. And we're not going to be changing the pipe size of the existing pipes anytime soon, I don't believe. So there's a physical limit to how much gas can flow through those pipes. The other constraint that's on the operators is a policy constraint, which makes sense. That basically says, in periods of very low temperatures, commercial and industrial users of gases needs are going to be subordinated to residential people who need fuel for heating, which makes sense. So if we have a generator that's using natural gas and we have a pipe constraint, and even if we didn't have the constraint, we would have to curtail the usage of generating facilities that use gas from those pipes so that residential customers can use them, it begs the question, what must be done? I would submit, through our review, that liquefied natural gas is probably a good path for that until we get through the transition. I won't go into the details because I want to make my comments a lot brief, and my colleague here from ISO New England is going to speak to that a little bit more. I will say that there's been some transmission interconnection projects that have faced challenges in New England, and those are on the screen there, and we could talk about that as we move on. Again, and I'm going to summarize, the region's significant clean energy and electrification goals are challenging. They're laudable, they make sense, but in the short term, they're challenging. And if there's not a technology that can be brought to bear or a technology that it can be kept so that the system operators, the balancing authorities can continue to make certain that we match the supply with the demand, we're going to have challenges. And those challenges are going to be, we're going to curtail users. Either that's going to be through some voluntary curtailment or it may be through forced curtailment, depending on how extreme the weather and how big the gap is. This is going to be exacerbated by transportation electrification and the projected proliferation of electric vehicles. Those devices are going to use even more electricity, so what we have right now is going to become more strained. The tools that we've had in the past have served us well. I'll close on this, but that's the past. We're talking about now and the future. I submit to you as a long-term utility executive and one who did it, and now someone on the other side of the fence adjudicating how it gets done or regulating how it gets done, that those tools will not be as effective because we're starting to face more extreme weather, and extreme no longer is synonymous with rare. Just because it's extreme, it's not rare. And we're going to have tools for the balancing authorities and the utilities to use to bridge us to that ultimate state where we want to be completely renewable. And with that, I'll close my comments for questions.
Next, we turn to Stephen George from ISO New England for our second presentation, and then we will turn back to the commissioners for comments and questions.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, commissioners, FERC staff, New England stakeholders, and fellow panelists. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to speak with you about these important issues. Today I will review a few key points from the presentation that we submitted last week, just focusing on a few key areas, and I'll refer to specific slides as we go through the discussion this morning. So as we all know, over time, the region has become highly reliant on natural gas for power generation, really over the past 20 years, as you can see on this slide here, with an increase from about 15% of our energy being produced by natural gas back in 2000 up to 53% last year in 2021. Also noticeably, the contributions from oil and coal have decreased over the same time period, and while they look small on the chart, I can tell you that in the winter, those energy contributions from the remaining coal fleet and the remaining oil generators are critical. And we'll talk about that a little more as we go today. So driven by New England state policy targets, we all know that renewable energy is on the rise. If you look at ISO's interconnection queue, you'll see 17,000 of the 30,000 megawatts of resources looking to interconnect are wind, with battery storage and solar not too far behind. And as we integrate these new technologies, it's important to think about what's happening to the existing resources. And as you can see on this slide, over the past 8 or 10 years, roughly since 2013, we've seen the retirement or the announced plans for retirement of up to 7,000 megawatts of generation, primarily nuclear, coal, and oil generation. So as we think about the transition, it's important to know not only what's coming, but what's going. We know that retirements tend to happen on time. It's easy to shut down the facility, but it's tough to get it back going. And as we've seen over the years, it can be challenging to develop and deploy new technologies. So we need to remain cognizant of what's happening in terms of resource retirements. So today, in this context of new technology coming in and older technologies retiring, the region finds itself reliant again on natural gas, and more specifically, highly reliant on imported liquefied natural gas, or LNG, and oil in the winter. The region, in fact, relies heavily on the import of these fuels by barge, ship, truck, or pipeline, and as we've seen in previous winters, the replenishment associated with that can take quite some time, especially under extreme weather conditions. So you can see clearly on this map, on this slide, the pipelines coming from the west and the LNG facilities that serve the region in the east. We have 3 LNG facilities that provide significant capability to the region, that have the ability to offset constrained pipelines from the west. Starting in the north, we have the St. John LNG facility in New Brunswick, capable of up to 10 BCF of storage, or roughly 6,000 megawatts of generation for 24 hours over the course of 10 days. Further down the coast in Everett, Mass., we have the Everett Marine Terminal with just over 3 BCF of storage, capable of supplying not only the Mystic generating facility, but also directly injecting into the Algonquin and Tennessee pipelines, as well as the National Grid LDC system. So vast capability there, very flexible, and provides significant capability to the region, especially during cold winters. And lastly, the Accelerate buoy just off the coast of Salem, Massachusetts, is another facility with valuable capability, though it is infrequently used. I can say from experience that we're always happy to see a ship on its way to the buoy at the Accelerate facility. So we know that LNG is important, but what we've seen in the past is when natural gas prices are rising, the region turns itself to oil-fired generation. And particularly, a couple examples of that are in the winter of 2017-18 and the winter of 21-22, where we burned significant quantities of oil. 17-18, we burned roughly 1 million gallons of oil. 100 million gallons of oil over the course of roughly a 2-week period. Last winter, we burned roughly 80 million gallons over the course of, say, a few weeks, the middle of January till the beginning of February, where temperatures were below normal. So these observations highlight the importance of the remaining oil fleet, particularly during cold weather, which in fact is comprised of vast storage and generating capability. So as a way of a brief summary, we have approximately 13 gigawatts of oil-fired generating capability. Roughly 70% of that is fueled by a distillate fuel oil, or DFO as we call it, so a lighter fuel oil. And interestingly, as far as storage capability goes, we have roughly 240 million gallons of storage capability at the region's generating sites, and 70% of that capability resides with the residual fuel oil, or the heavy fuel oil fired resources that we would characterize as being most at risk for retirement. So when we think about LNG and oil, our experience has been that replenishment becomes a critical factor. So leading into the winter and throughout the winter, we track LNG cargoes, we track oil inventories and replenishment plans to maintain situational awareness of really what type of fuel and amount of fuel is going to be available to the region's generating fleet. And we've, by necessity, have had to develop this capability really over the past, say, 10 to 15 years. So in terms of close calls, we've had a number of close calls over the past couple of decades, primarily as a result of the region's constrained natural gas system, its reliance on imported fuels, and vulnerability to correlated contingencies. So nearly 20 years ago, back in January of 2004, the events first shed light on New England's constrained pipeline and the risk associated with that. Only 10 years later, during the polar vortex, we saw similar events, constrained pipelines, operational challenges, and in this case, reserve deficiencies. Moving forward a little bit closer to today, we've seen more recent issues, particularly during the winter of 17-18, where we were only days away from running out of usable fuel in the region. Anybody that was in New England at that time or had interest in the region probably remembers this winter. There was roughly 13 days of below average temperatures, below normal temperatures. And we, as I mentioned earlier, burned about 100 million gallons of oil. We're close to environmental limits on several generating facilities and had significant replenishment challenges brought on by the extreme cold weather, icing of rivers, and things like that, which highlight the challenges of replenishing those key fuels when the weather gets rough. Moving on to last winter, we wanted to highlight a few issues we had on the 11th and 12th of January that we refer to as correlated contingencies in order to highlight the risk associated with essentially unexpected events occurring on other systems or non-electric systems and the potential impact those can have on New England. So while on either the 11th or 12th of January we did not have any emergency procedures and we maintained reliability throughout, we experienced potential reductions in import capability from New York, Hydro-Quebec, and at the same time lost approximately 1,100 megawatts of generating capability. On the following day, on the 12th, we received word from the New Brunswick system operator of a loss of the single electric feed to the St. John LNG facility in New Brunswick. At the time, the amount of gas being supplied by that facility was relatively low. The pipelines were able to make up the difference, and as I mentioned before, there was no impact to system reliability. But essentially, these events or correlated contingencies again highlight the importance of our awareness of the potential for impacts due to these correlated contingencies or events on other parts of the system exterior to New England. So looking forward, we find that these historical events are informative, and we've made a variety of market and operational enhancements since they've occurred, some of which are detailed in the presentation we submitted for Panel 2. And to help the understanding of risk across the region and inform our decision-making going forward, there's a variety of studies underway or that have been completed, including the Future Grid Reliability Study, which focuses on 2040 and the operational needs in that time frame, as well as the 2050 Transmission Study, which focuses on the needs from a transmission perspective in terms of integrating renewable resources. And finally, the operational impacts of extreme weather studies that we're performing in conjunction with EPRI, which will help us identify really the events that are highly impactful to New England from an energy perspective, and will give us an understanding of the depth and extent and duration of those types of events so that we can then begin to think about what the solutions are, how much risk we're willing to accept, and how we might address those risks. So when we think about the future, we've been thinking about it in context of the 4 pillars, which I'm sure you've seen, which include significant amounts of renewable energy, robust transmission, and the 2 we're focusing most on today, balancing resources and energy adequacy. We know that balancing resources, as Charles mentioned a few minutes ago, will be critical to ensuring the supply-demand balance in times where the renewable resources may not be generating or their output may be variable due to the impacts of weather. And we know that it's likely in the near term that those balancing resources will need to be fueled by natural gas or some other stored fuel until the time that the region develops another alternative clean energy source that can provide that same long duration of energy. So in conclusion, in the context of New England and its vast renewable energy potential, we need to make sure that we have a plan that ensures energy adequacy throughout the transition to renewables, including the impacts of electrification of the heating and transportation sectors. And as part of that, we need to ensure that we retain or have access to sufficient infrastructure and stabilize fuel supply chains, again, until that clean energy is available in sufficient quantities. Thank you for your time and attention this morning, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much, both Mr. Dickerson and Mr. George, for setting this scene for us. We're going to have an opportunity for each of the commissioners to make opening statements, and then we're going to get into questions. When we do get into questions, each commissioner will have an equal opportunity to ask them. And if you, obviously, I'm sure most of you have done this already. If you have something to say, just lift your placard up and we'll call on you. But I want to start out first by thanking, first of all, FERC staff for the extremely hard work of getting this all this event all together and the background work and so on. And secondly, want to thank all of you, not only the panelists on panel one, but all the panelists that are participating today. I know you all have very busy schedules, and we appreciate the taking your time out and coming here and doing that. You know, after we leave here, we're all going to go home, and we're going to switch on the lights, and we expect the lights to come on. And then this winter, we'll turn the thermostat on. Hopefully, won't be too cold, but we'll turn the thermostat on, and we expect the heat to work. And that's just generally the way it works, and people have become accustomed to that. But obviously, you know, there's been a lot of discussion this summer, in particular, about electric grid reliability, but also there's concerns, especially in this region, about natural gas reliability as well. But in terms of the electric grid, I think we've seen it just this week in California, just unprecedented. You shouldn't exactly right, Mr. Dickerson. You said you should, you know, just because I think you said just because it's extreme doesn't mean it's rare. And so when I say unprecedented, that's probably not a good word anymore, because this extreme weather is with us, and it's probably going to get worse. And the extreme temperatures that we've seen this week, along with the drought going on in the West and wildfires and everything else that's going on, really stressed the California ISO system. And the situation isn't over yet, but they've done a tremendous job of helping to keep the lights on. And in most parts of the country, the concern we have is that there may not be sufficient amounts of energy available at a certain period of time when there's high demand to keep the lights on. New England's a slightly different situation, in the sense that there seems to be enough generating capacity. It's just that there is, especially during prolonged bouts of cold, there may not be, it's a fuel issue. There may be, there's concerns about there being a lack of sufficient fuel. And Mr. George, in particular, highlighted some of the challenges that New England faces. But it's something that, you know, fortunately, it's been pointed out that even though there's been a lot of close calls, there hasn't been any significant rolling outages or anything like that, or any rolling outages related specifically to this particular problem. But and this winter, the ISO laid out a report, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about some, which suggested at least under a regular winter or even a mild winter, probably not going to see significant problems either. But that doesn't mean that the challenges go away. The challenges certainly are ahead of us into the future as well, and it's expected to get worse. I think the concern to me is not, it's a temporal concern, right? There's a short-term issue, which is making sure there's enough fuel, and that there's a big focus on LNG in particular, and I know we're going to talk about that a lot today, in large part because there just isn't sufficient pipeline capacity into New England, and if you're going to need gas, that's the other way of getting it. But to me, if you spend all your time talking about just LNG and not talking about the longer-term fixes, we're going to have to, and there's going to be transmission, other generation, both in the region and elsewhere, electric transmission. There are energy efficiency, demand response. There's all sorts of tools at our disposal. But if we spend all our time talking about just how we're going to keep the Everett LNG facility, for instance, open, and that very well may need to happen in the short term. But if we just do that, talk about that today I think will be a failure. We have to talk about what else needs to be done, because relying on importing LNG, as we've seen world events over the last year, just is not a sustainable solution. We have to figure something else out, and I really look forward to the discussion today. Secondly, I want to point out, you all know this well too, that energy prices are much higher than they were last year, in large part because of higher natural gas prices. Now, we look at domestic natural gas prices just throughout the country at various sites in Henry Hub and so on. They're high, but they're not nearly as high as they are here in New England because of, again, reliance on LNG and expectation that there's going to be there could be shortages. But that is something we need to think about. Not only do we need to think about how to keep the lights on, how to keep the heat going, we also need to think about the cost impacts. How do we do things in a cost-effective manner? Because it's what's going on in Europe is it's hard to think about in terms of the prices. Now, fortunately, it's not going to be that bad in the United States for a variety of reasons, but nonetheless, it could be significant pain to consumers, and we need to think about that as we move forward. So I very much look forward to the discussion today. I want to, before concluding, want to point out one other thing. I think, there's a good opportunity here for finger pointing. Everyone can blame someone else. You should have done this. You should have done that. But the fact is, I don't think that's very productive. We are where we are, and the fact is that we have to figure out a way, essentially, to dig ourselves out of this. And that's, so it's tempting to finger point, but I would urge, whether it be FERC, the ISO, utilities, LDC, states, other stakeholders here, that we all figure out a way to work together and figure out a path forward, and to do it in a way, again, for reliability purposes and also from a consumer perspective. So again, I look forward to what I think is going to be a very interesting, long discussion today, but a very important discussion, and appreciate everyone's participation. And now I'll turn it over to Commissioner Danley for his opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm here because of my longstanding concern about the possibility of a catastrophic reliability event here in the Northeast. I think everybody who watches FERC is well aware of the fact that I've been banging that drum pretty consistently, and I put it down in large measure to failures of the market and the two problems that we all know we have here. The first is constraints from the natural gas supply, and the second are state policies that are driving dispatchable generation out of existence. And these policies that the states have enacted, which they're perfectly entitled to enact under the Federal Power Act, I don't quibble at all with that. But they have their consequences. ISO New England, in their assessment, said that if they followed the deep decarbonization program, they'd have to increase the reserve from 15 to 300%. So even if ISO New England was off by an order of magnitude, you'd still have to double the reserve margin. That's a pretty chilling set of consequences when you consider what we're trying to do is administrate markets that produce just and reasonable rates. So we've gotten to a point where it seems to me that the market is unable, through market mechanisms, to ensure resource adequacy, and that's a real problem. And it doesn't seem as though the region, as a region, is going to be able to very easily grapple with this or arrive at solutions. I don't see the likelihood of a lot of new greenfield pipeline development being easy. We've seen that there are even, very reasonable, to my mind anyway, reasonable transmission projects have been impeded, and the likelihood that you can rely, as the chairman said, on a perpetual prayer that LNG imports are going to make up the shortfall seems to me to be unwise. We basically have reached a point where New England as a region is vulnerable to any number of not completely unlikely contingencies, any one of which could cause serious problems. We really shouldn't be running an electric or gas system that basically says, well, let's just wake up tomorrow morning and again cross our fingers that Everett doesn't go down. That seems like a really, really bad plan. And so, in the absence of being able to fix this through market mechanisms, because the markets are constrained by the public policies in which it operates and by the physical reality of the gas that's available, and being unable to, it seems to me that at the moment at any rate, unless there's some catastrophic reliability event that changes people's thinking, I think the state's policies appear to be relatively invariant right now, and their consequences are real and they're already being felt. The question that I and my colleagues have in front of us is, what exactly is it that we do, given the fact that we have a statutory obligation to ensure just and reasonable rates? And to the extent to which any of the panelists or my colleagues want to engage in that specific subject, that is the question for us, because that's our statutory obligation and those are the powers that we have. So with that, I'm done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Danley. Commissioner Clements.
Thank you, Chairman Glick, and I'll add my thanks to the staff who did a really bang-up job on both the substance and the logistics of being back in person today. It's nice to see you all, and thanks for making the time to come out. I commend you, Chairman Glick, for hosting this forum. You know, it's designed as a full day of talking about the problem. How many of you have ever been subjected to, in your work life, a Myers-Briggs test or a StrengthsFinders test, right? And how many of you actually liked it? Okay, good, well, that's encouraging. So I used to like them, and then I took this StrengthsFinder, and I was, you know, every good characteristic has a bad side to it, a shadow side, and I was told that I'm an indiscriminate problem solver. That didn't feel particularly satisfying, and it felt a little underhanded. But in any case, it's my instinct to jump right to, okay, give me your plate of solutions. Let's talk through them and figure them out. Let's get it done. But I appreciate the fact that stakeholders have said, let's take the time to get nuanced around this problem. Let's be specific about the set of complex and over the last 2 decades, seemingly intractable set of issues that are contributing to this system's problem. And I think that's a really good use of time today. You know, collectively, we are all concerned. No one in this room is unconcerned about getting through this winter. No one in this room is unconcerned about getting through next winter. I hope today we can think about that, but also go broader. Let's get off of this spin cycle of crisis every fall, right? And as soon as we get through the winter, whew, here we go again. Let's talk about what that set of ultimately solutions, we're on problems still, but ultimately the set of solutions, whether they be state solutions, federal solutions, local solutions, we should have that time. And today we're not bound by jurisdictional barriers. In practice, we are. Let's acknowledge those barriers, but let's not stop them. Let's not let them stop us from having the conversation around all the pieces of the problem and the set of information we need to start getting at that problem longer term. Coordination across the states and the federal government, like we're starting to see and like is happening today, is really critical. But for today, step 1 is the problem definition. So let's be clear-eyed. Let's be, objective in our assessment. To the chairman's point, yes, absolutely, we need to shore up fuel sources right now, but that is not the only piece of the puzzle. We are evolving a system. We're not replacing units one for one for one. We are evolving, not revolutionizing, we're evolving a system over time. So tell us specifically, to the extent you've had operational problems, how did they emerge? In what time frame did they emerge? How much notice do you have? To the extent that quantitative analysis is showing risks going forward, what kind of risks are they? What time frame are they in? Because foreseeable future is not a time frame relative to the potential to get specific with quantitative analysis. I think I'm really glad to hear Commissioner Danley bring up, the market design piece of this and what the opportunities are there. What are the problems now? And problem in some cases is the right label, and some is just what is the state of the markets that have historically provided, place value on services that are changing, on services that are maybe less needed now, or that market designs that aren't as nuanced as they could be relative to winter value and summer value for any given resource. So that's what I'm hoping we do today, and I really appreciate the participation by all of the panelists. I look forward to your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Clements. Commissioner Christie?
I agree with the chairman that if all we talk about today is Everett, that's not a really productive outcome for this conference. It may be a short-term necessity for the winter. I think no one disputes that. And if all we talk about is gas-electric scheduling or trying to tweak that a little bit, that's not really a long-term solution either. So I think the chairman's right. I hope we hear about some long-term solutions and not just what it takes to get through the next 3 or 4 months. And if all we hear about is Everett, I think that's not really a good use of time. But what is the long-term solution? And I'd love to hear from all the speakers we have today. It really comes down to one word, and that's supply. Or I should say 2 words, power supply. ISO New England, which often gets the blame and shouldn't, let's remember what ISO New England does. ISO New England is a balancing authority. Like every other balancing authority, it has to balance supply and demand every second of every day to keep the lights on. Well, they cannot balance supply if there is no supply, if there's not enough supply. And so the supply has to be there, and I hope the focus is going to be on where's the supply going to come from? Where is the reliable supply going to come from? And I emphasize reliable because 1 megawatt of nameplate wind is not equal to 1 megawatt of nameplate gas, coal, nuclear, or another dispatchable resource. It's not. And so we have to talk about supply. Now, one possibility, and I'd love to hear from speakers today, the New England governors had a very interesting letter, and they proposed in their letter, I think it was to Secretary Granholm, or maybe to the president, but I was reading the substance of the letter. One of the things they proposed was an energy reserve. Well, California just admitted they needed an energy reserve, meaning out-of-market units, reliability units, all dispatchable, by the way, in California. They want to keep Diablo Canyon open, nuclear. They want to keep gas going. And so one possibility up here in New England, I've talked about this with some of your state regulators, is to create a reliability reserve in New England that would be reliability units, dispatchable units. And there's a lot of ways to get there, and I'd love to hear ideas from people. You know, you could put them in rate base, have individual states individually or collectively share them in rate base, make them jurisdictional to 2 or 3 states. They could be procured through PPAs, but they don't have to be run through the market. Let's not think that this RTO market, which is really not a market at all, we all know that. They're not markets, they're administrative constructs. There are other ways to get the reliability units that you need. And I would love to hear the ideas, and I commend the governors of New England for floating the idea of an energy reserve that could potentially be units that are back in rate base or even through PPA. So I think there's a lot of ways to get there, but the key word is supply. ISO can't balance supply and demand if there is no supply. So we need to be focusing like a laser beam on supply. Where's it going to come from in the long term? That's the big issue for me, and I'd love to hear from the speakers today. And thank you for all coming, and I certainly look forward to hearing your ideas.
Thanks, Commissioner Christie. Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all the speakers for coming today, and I thank everybody in attendance. In particular, I want to thank Mr. Dickerson and Mr. George for laying out the broad strokes, really, of the issue that's in front of us. You know, I want to underscore a point that the chairman made earlier about what's happening in Europe, and really, I'm struck by the similarities that we have here in New England. I just spent earlier this week some time with some of the European regulators and talking about their issue. When you think about, you know, some of the things that they're facing, and Commissioner Christie, you're absolutely right. You know, it's a supply issue. That's what we have at its center. But beyond that, you layer on top of that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and really what that has done to the global market for LNG and natural gas. If you look at New England now, I mean, what are we talking about? We have an unexpected delay in bringing on renewable resources to the system. You couple that with the reliance on generators for LNG injections, and then you have an uncertain LNG market for the winter, which everything that relies on is waiting on. And then you have to add prayers that we have a mild winter on top of that. It's very similar. And so one other thing I'll say, Mr. George, nobody in the room appreciates you doing the math on 2004. That's almost 20 years ago. We didn't need to know that this morning. 2004 is fine. When you just say 2004 is just fine. I'm kidding with you, sir. But in all seriousness, what I'm looking to hear from the speakers today, I want to know, what are the long-term and near-term reliability impacts and tools at our disposal to use? I want to know, what are the long-term and near-term, in particular, affordability impacts? I'm really focused on what this is going to cost our consumers if we don't get this right. And I'm going to steal a term from ISO New England, something you said in your call to action. You said something like, if reliability and affordability suffers, then sustainability will also suffer. I believe that's true. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Phillips. So we're going to go into a series of questions, and given the time, I'm going to ask two questions and then pass it on to our colleagues. We'll see how much time we have at the end there. But the first one's going to be pretty broad. I'm going to ask all of you to respond. And I'm just curious, in your view, what do you believe are the greatest challenges the region faces from an energy perspective, and how do you suggest we try to address the risks or mitigate the risks associated with those challenges? And I'll go down the table and start with Mr. Brown, if that's okay.
Well, I think the risks are twofold. They're both reliability and affordability. We've seen both of those be challenged, especially over the last decade. We've had severe volatility in prices, and obviously ISO has laid out the concerns about reliability. As far as solutions go, we've turned our back on a couple of solutions, in the past decade. Transmission projects from Canada that would have helped. They definitely would have helped reduce prices this winter, where you're looking at forward strips of $260 a megawatt hour. I've heard peak pricing is somewhere in the $300 a megawatt hour range. Natural gas infrastructure projects like Access Northeast, which would have, a lot of that was built on was comprised on storage, which probably would have reduced those prices somewhere. And because right now Algonquin, forward strips for natural gas are $40 an MMBTU, where neighboring regions are, $9, $7 an MMBTU. Maybe they could have reduced those numbers down to, $30 or $25 an MMBTU. And if you look at some studies that were done in the past, I think ICF did one on Access Northeast in 2015. That kind of number would have reduced electricity costs by roughly 22%. So you're talking about potential savings of billions of dollars. So I guess those are the two, the two biggest challenges, which is no big secret to anybody in this room. So thank you.
First, thank you for the question, and thank you for convening this important discussion. I feel like we've been here before. I certainly think those in the audience and those here on the panel will agree. I think for us at Northeast Gas Association, we look at the challenges in maybe 4 buckets, and I'll emphasize 2 of those, and we've already talked about that. One is affordability. In the Northeast area, New England area, since 2010, we've spent $3 billion more on energy than the rest of the country. And that should be, if it isn't, certainly alarming, for us, because energy prices, we're talking about $9 gas right now. We could potentially spike to $40 gas, in January. And when you put that and you do the math, that could equate to a $1,000 utility bill for an everyday consumer, here in our region. I don't know about you, but I don't want to spend $1,000 on my utility bill, let alone everything else that I have to, compete for. So I think for us, it's really a focus on affordability and how do we make sure that we don't leave our lower income zip codes behind. Coupled with that, energy efficiency. In energy efficiency, and when I say these things, they aren't solutions in and of by themselves. They're cohesive and they have to work together. But for our energy efficiency investments that we make, 40% of the $1.5 billion that we spend in this country on energy efficiency happens in this region. And we must continue to invest in that because, again, I talked about the lower income zip codes, I talked about affordability, but more than that, when we start paying a premium for the price of energy, that energy we cannot waste. We cannot waste. And I would be remiss to say that, for the work that we've been doing in the natural gas industry and making sure that energy is transported from where it's produced to where it's finally delivered to consumers is one of the most efficient and safest ways to do so. So those are the things that I see in front of us: affordability, energy efficiency, and then the other 2 things I would say is, and probably the biggest challenge, if not those 2, are really around how we can strike a balance of innovative technology investments. We believe in an all-the-above responsible investment that includes renewable natural gas, responsibly sourced gas, geothermal pricing, wind and solar. Yes, the gas guy is saying wind and solar has a place in our economy. We believe, though, that natural gas does as well. And so how do we create opportunities for us to talk about that? So again, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
My answer is going to be a little strange, Mr. Chairman. In addition to what all the commissioners said, which I agree with all the comments, I think the two biggest problems facing the region right now is that I don't think that we're dealing with some of the kind of the realities of the world. If we had 100% nameplate or twice the nameplate capacity of all renewables and no dispatchable generation, we would still have an issue because we can't control the wind or the sun. And part of that balancing act is constantly controlling it. So the notion that renewables are going to solve everything in the absence of mature storage technology just isn't going to exist. Some people sometimes shriek, Commissioner Clemens, when I did a Berkman, I tend to be kind of direct. And I think it's the most efficient use of people's time is to be direct. 100% renewables at 3 times the nameplate capacity won't do the balancing authority any good if the wind just stopped blowing. So one of the solutions is that we need a dispatchable technology for when that happens. So part of the challenge is we all have to come to grips and alignment with that as a mindset, because we're not going to move the needle if we don't. The second thing I'll say quickly, and I think you, Mr. Chairman, said it and a few of your colleagues said it, this is a temporal issue. So there's an old saying, what do you do if you encounter a village full of starving people? Do you feed them or teach them how to fish? The answer is both. So our feeding is what we're going to do in the short term. Because even though you're right, Commissioner Clinton, we kind of get back every fall, but we're still going to have to get through this winter coming, and if it's bad, we're going to have to be able to do it. But we can't rest on our laurels there. We need a long-term solution. And as my colleague Charles Cruz said, it's going to have to include a variety of different supply sources, and it's going to have to include energy efficiency so that those supply sources aren't wasted. But I would think that we're going to have to quickly come to terms with what the realities are. And if we don't come to terms with those realities, we're blowing in the wind, pun intended.
Thank you for the question. I'll try to be brief. I think the two challenges we need to think about are first, infrastructure, and then second, getting the energy we need through that infrastructure. So when I talk about infrastructure, I'm talking about making sure that we are, again, thoughtful about what we need now and in the future. We know that once things are retired, it's hard to get them back, and it is equally challenging to build new infrastructure. So we need to be thoughtful about that, and not just Everett. And we'll talk about Everett a lot today, but there's other facilities that we'll need to think about as well. And then when we think about energy, once we have the infrastructure either retained or in place, we need to think about how do we get the energy through that infrastructure? So whether that's through the markets, whether it's a regional storage program, or some of the other ideas that have been brought up this morning, we need to think about how we're going to get the energy through that infrastructure. From an operational perspective, and that's my background, I think in the long term, we need to get out of the business of tracking LNG ships across the ocean. It's not sustainable. It's not reliable. It's probably not very efficient, but that's what we do today. So we need to figure out a way to make sure that we're not going into every winter guessing how much fuel we're going to have at the 3 LNG facilities or in the oil tanks in New England. So to do all that, we have to complete the studies that we have in progress so we understand the depth and duration and extent of the problem. And then, as was proposed in the call to action memo, is there's a next step, right? And that's deciding, what risk the region wants to tolerate, and then what are the ways we can go about addressing that risk. And I think to some of the points made by the commissioners and chairman this morning, we can learn from the mistakes of other areas. We can learn from what they've done well. We're lucky in that we have that opportunity. So we have a pretty great opportunity in front of us. And I think luckily today we have all the right people in the room to begin to tackle that challenge. Thank you.
First, thank you for the opportunity to offer a few comments today. You asked great questions. If I had them in advance, I probably would have spent all weekend thinking about them. But I've tried to put together a few notes, and I guess what, in my experience of 25 years dealing with these markets, the first point I think I want to make is, in the long term, our assumptions that we make today will be wrong. They have been in the past. They probably will be in the future, too. There's things that will happen that we didn't anticipate. No one would have anticipated what would happen with Ukraine this year. And that's just one example. The other is, I think we need to keep an eye on the entire picture. It's very easy to jump into the center of a problem or the edge of a problem, and you don't know whether it's the center or the edge until after the fact. And I think the suggestion made by Commissioner Clements was a very wise one. We need to understand the nuances of the problem we face and what the impacts are. As an example, if you were to take the problem statement as submitted in advance of this forum, focusing on a specific class of assets or assets through some program, if they might stabilize that asset or assets, but it's going to destabilize all of the other assets that rely on the market revenues. And you know, if there's a need for LNG, then we need to understand why we don't have incentives today. We need to get the signals right in the market, and we need to have the right people responsible for that. I'm not sure having ISO in charge of LNG procurement and delivery is necessarily the right thing, whether that's sitting behind the panel or even under a contract directing the procurements. And the other thing I wanted to identify is that I'm not sure it's an efficient solution to try to pre-decide any particular approach in the long term now, and even in the short term, we should be worried about putting all of our eggs in one basket, whether that's in LNG or in a single facility delivering that. Certainly, one of the luxuries I have is my past also precedes the beginning of the restructuring, and working in a regulated utility dealing with maintaining reliable electric service. That was actually a theme of all of the considerations at that time, is whatever you think is going to save you today may be the problem tomorrow, and you need a plan for that. And I think that all gets back to making sure we define the problem very well up front. And more importantly, to me, having worked for the 25 years, doing that through an effective discussion. And let me define effective discussion. It's interaction with the stakeholders and forcing everyone at the table to answer the tough questions that you just put before us. So I would give you the challenge of, there's some homework assignment for the region, whether it's ISO and NEPL in the States. It's to force us to answer those tough questions so that you have the confidence that we have sufficiently defined the problem and do understand the nuances before we jump to something. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for having us all, and thank you to your staff for putting on such a great event today. We know how hard they work and really appreciate it. And since I have all four of you here, I just also wanted to say one quick thing, which is really want to thank you for the effort that you all are making and have been making to engage the states and to have us be problem solvers together. And you know, all the years I've been practicing, I don't think that there has ever been a commission that is more committed to that cooperation. So thank you for that. We really appreciate that. So, you know, I think the underlying problem is that we're overly dependent on a single fuel. We're overly dependent on natural gas, and the entire region is at risk any time that we have some kind of disruption on that system. And customers, as we are really seeing this winter, it also means that they are tied to volatile international market prices. You know, like other New England states, in Massachusetts, our rates this winter are very concerning. I think if you ask any consumer advocate in New England right now, they would say that their biggest concern is whether people are going to be able to pay their bills this winter. So, you know, the obvious answer to being too reliant is to diversify and to make sure that we have other options besides relying completely on one fuel. That has been over time difficult for our region. We've often tried to address the problem of reliance on one fuel by saying, let's have more natural gas. First it was a pipeline, and looking back on it now, thank goodness we didn't do that, because we would have been even more dependent on natural gas than we are today. There are market issues, but we're in a very different place today. We are on the cusp of a major transformation of our generation supply. Next year we'll have our first offshore wind facility online. New England is going to have 8,000 megawatts of offshore wind ready to go. In Massachusetts, our 5,600 will be online by 2027. And offshore wind can be a piece of the winter puzzle. ISO did a study fairly recently about the cyclone bomb and what would have happened if there was a 1,600 megawatt offshore wind facility. How would they have performed during that sort of, I think it was 2-week period? And it was well. They had a high capacity factor, and the study showed that gas reduction, the generation use of gas would be reduced by about 20% and oil by about 7%. So it's a piece of the puzzle. It's not the answer. But I think that we need to think about, as everyone else has been saying, there's a difference between what time period we're talking about. There's this winter, there's the next 2 winters, there's the winters following. So I think we do need to think about solutions in that term, in different terms, because there are going to be different options available to us as time goes on. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you all for having us here today for this very important dialogue. As we have heard from each other thus far, definitely reliability and affordability are the 2 boxes we must check, and both are at significant risk for this region. When we think about the solutions, I believe that the solutions will include many things, but one of the things that it must include is additional natural gas infrastructure. The LDCs today have the ability to procure gas transportation, work with their state agencies to get approval to serve their home and business heating loads. And as a result, those LDCs have been utilizing more and more of their capacity through the years. At this point in time, there's very little unused capacity during the winter peak. So when the electric generators go out to try to procure fuel, natural gas, they have to pay very high prices. They're buying it as delivered commodities, perhaps from marketers. The region relies on LNG, and it creates a very expensive proposition for the New England area. So if there is a mechanism for electric generators to procure capacity, some mechanism to figure out how to allocate those costs, because they currently do not have an incentive to purchase it today. An extra capacity would also be used to help backstop and balance the renewables. During the Texas Uri winter storm, Texas has the most wind generation of all the states, and the wind completely fell offline within a 4-hour period, because when it gets extremely cold, the wind typically stops blowing. And so when you think about such a significant amount of the renewable resources falling off in a 4-hour period, you need a dispatchable source of fuel that can help fill in that gap while it's falling off, and of course be seamless once it goes offline to keep our lights on. So I think it's very important to manage the affordability and the reliability of any of our fuel sources. When we think about an additional pipeline infrastructure, and it was talked about here earlier, Kinder Morgan had a project in 2014, 2015, the Northeast Energy Direct project, $1.5 BCF of capacity into the region. It was subscribed about halfway with LDC incremental demand, but there just wasn't a structure to allow for the generators to be able to look to subscribe for capacity. So it was a frustrated project. Had that project gone in service, which it was targeted for November of 2018, it would have saved the region $2.8 billion between November of 2018 and today. So that is a significant amount of money. So natural gas is affordable, it is reliable, and it is plentiful in the United States. We all don't have to look past the first page on any news feed or news article about what's going on in Europe. Europe is about 10 years ahead of us on the energy transition path. And even last summer, prior to the Ukraine-Russia incident, Europe declared natural gas is needed for the long term. It needs to be a part of the portfolio. So as we think about what the solutions are, it will be a combination platter, but it does need to include natural gas. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Watson. Thank you, everybody. In the interest of time, I want to make sure everyone has enough opportunity to ask questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Danley.
Thank you. So, beginning, Mr. Brown, you're talking about ratepayers, and what I would just like to open up a few minutes for you to give me your thoughts about what the rate consequences are going to be, given the situation that New England is facing right now over, let's say, the next couple of years and then over the long term, especially if the policies that are currently in place remain in place, let's say, over the next 10 years or so.
Well, yeah, it's impossible for me to tell you exactly what's going to happen, but we can look at the past to kind of give us foreshadowing on what's going to happen in the future. So we've seen price spikes. You know, right now, retail electricity rates are 25 cents a kilowatt hour in New Hampshire, and I think that we're looking at similar rates in other states. The winter of 17-18, we saw price spikes into billions, in the billions of dollars to consumers in the region. 13 and 14, we saw increased cost of $3 billion in the region from lack of, and one of those reasons was lack of pipeline infrastructure. Yes, it's true that we are relying on natural gas, and natural gas does set, the market rate about 70 to 80% of the time. So I think part of the solution needs to be to find a way to reduce the cost of natural gas generation in the region, and part of that solution has to be finding a way to incent natural gas generators to subscribe to capacity, so that we can deliver more gas at an affordable rate, similar to, areas that are just a few hundred miles away, and we have abundant supply just a few hundred miles away. So, I would love to be able to tell you, oh, it's going to cost, consumers $4.2 billion next year and $3.1 billion. I can't give you the number. It's going to hurt. It's going to drive manufacturers out of the region. It's going to disproportionately impact low-income consumers who always pay a larger portion of their income for energy costs. We've seen it, a byproduct of public policies is, housing stock. And, you talk to manufacturers and they're concerned about being able to pay employees to be able to cover these costs. So if they have facilities in other states, they're looking at other states to expand. So there's going to be downstream economic impacts of all of these increased energy costs as well. So to answer your question, I can't accurately answer your question, but it's going to hurt, and there's going to be consequences.
Mr. Cruz, the same question to you, and having been chastised, I don't expect a crystal ball. Best guess you have. Right?
Yeah, I think it certainly is a good question. I appreciate Mark's, comments. You do have to reflect back to the past to see what the impact is going to be on ratepayers. But I'll begin or start where I kind of ended in terms of how. Let me back up. One of the things that I often do as an operator, I've been in this business now for 30 years or so, and I use this fundamental tool to figure out a problem, and that's asking 5 whys. Why are natural gas prices high? That's the first question. And the answer to that is, of course, we're paying a premium when it comes to LNG. We don't have the benefit of having geology on our side for storage, and so we have to rely on LNG in that regard. And so why are we relying on LNG? Because everything we've already said on this panel, we have a constrained pipeline system. And so I think for ratepayers, to your question, Commissioner Danley, is how do we make how do we, I'm going to use the word socialize, I don't mean to use that word, but how do we make our investments more palatable to the region? We're already doing that with modernization efforts that many utilities are making in keeping the gas in the pipe and modernizing and preparing them for the future. But I think we have to look at how we continue to do that and what policies and why are there policies that are preventing that. But again, to reemphasize what Mark already said, we're just 100 miles away from the most prolific shale basin in the United States. And I think the solution is how do we access that going forward.
So that seems to be a theme, right? Basic economic supply-demand, there's insufficient access to the supply. And so does anybody disagree that more supply is the fundamental point to keep rates low here when it comes to gas for New England right now? Anybody on the panel disagree with that?
Well, I would just add that I think it's not just a supply problem, and I think we also can address it some on the demand side. We've been very successful with energy efficiency here and greatly reducing our demand. And I think a very aggressive demand response program also could be part of the puzzle.
So acknowledging that demand response or any demand program or efficiency can help at the margins, there is still the fundamental question regarding the price of the commodity and what the access to that commodity, the lack of that access to the commodity and the price consequence of that will have on ratepayers. And so do you actually believe that demand programs can significantly reduce ratepayer costs when we're being told right now by the panel that it could be $1,000 a month utility bills? Do you think that efficient windows are going to fix that?
I think it can be a big part of the puzzle. I do, and I think it's, we haven't been all that creative with it, but we're gonna have huge resources and individual customers with their electric cars, with, you're looking at me very skeptically, but
I am, yes.
But, and I am 100% sure I will not be able to convince you today. But I do think that the energy efficiency that we have done in this region has been significant. And any hour that you don't need a megawatt hour is better and is the cheapest way to do it. So I do think that is a big piece of the puzzle. And demand response, we haven't even touched what we're going to be able to do with that. And I think we've got to be creative on that.
So having heard the one lone, it wasn't even necessarily dissent, but the nuance added there to my question regarding more access. So the question then becomes, unless we're going to build a bunch more LNG terminals, it seems like the likely method by which to have more access to the supply of the commodity that's necessary is the development of more pipeline infrastructure. I can't think of another really major way of solving that, and so I have a question. Anybody who wants to answer the question can raise their card. I see there are a couple people who want to speak. Actually, do you want to go ahead and answer the last one first? Sorry, I didn't notice that before.
Yes, Commissioner Danley. We're talking about expanding access to natural gas, which I think we all agree that we need a number of different solutions. One of the areas that I think where FERC may be able to helpful is that if we can be more supportive of imports coming from north of the border, Canada. There's a lot of renewable energy in Canada, hydro, and to the extent that we're able to bring that energy in, which is more cheap, probably more price competitive than natural gas. There's another reason, as we all know, why gas prices are high. When you have a whole bunch of people competing for the same thing, whether it's a fuel commodity, a house, or a car, the sellers have the advantage. And so if we could diversify even more our supply mix by bringing more energy in, cheaper energy, probably from Canada, I think that will help with that issue.
So I'm sure that that's true. I highlighted when I first spoke, though, that even transmission projects have been been subject to severe obstacles.
I agree with you.
Transmission projects, at least first glance, obviously I'm not the one who permits them. I can't imagine what the objection would have been because they seem to be needed and reasonable, but you know, whatever, it's not my choice. But yeah, sure, I accept that. But given the fact that probably, just like we shouldn't be in a position where we're tracking individual ships and crossing our fingers that they don't sink to the bottom of the ocean, right? We also probably shouldn't say we're going to roll one die here, and if it comes up, you know, 6, we're going to not get any more transmission, but every other solution isn't looked at. I guess the question I have for everybody is, what do you think the likelihood is that greenfield pipeline development is going to be possible in the region in any reasonable period of time absent a catastrophe? That's the question that I have. Sorry, if somebody has an answer to that and wants to speak to it, I would like to hear it, and then that'll be my last question. I'm being told I ran over. Sorry about that. Yes.
Sorry, Commissioner. I was hoping to speak to your last question. I just didn't want the...
Okay, then we'll leave my last question as a rhetorical question, and you can answer the last one.
I just simply didn't want the absence of an answer to your prior question to be interpreted as necessarily agreeing with the conclusion. It's a hard question for me to answer because if the question was if you can get access to Henry Hub gas without paying for anything, any other charges, clearly that would be cheaper. What isn't understood, at least by me, is what the cost of making such an investment now in light of the transition that the states have planned would be. It really just is a bigger picture, and I think gets back to Commissioner Clement's suggestion that we understand the nuances to a lot of these solutions without discounting any of them.
Right, thank you.
Commissioner Clements.
Thanks. Luckily, I can talk really fast. So we have supply and we have demand. Demand is the other half, right? We have all these pressures making it harder to get new supply, including the kind of real challenges related to new supply infrastructure development on the gas and the electric side. So to my mind, the idea that the lack of harnessing demand in a way, the idea that I think your presentation, Mr. Dickerson, looking to 2030, the only resource that didn't increase, the only predicted resource that didn't increase was demand response. It said 2,000 megawatts right now and 2,000 something megawatts in 2030. So to my mind, I think part of the problem I see is this other half of the equation, the other key word. And so I'm curious, Ms. Tepper, there's been a mention, you mentioned, and Mr. Dickerson and Mr. Cruz mentioned the success on energy efficiency. Has it been on the electric side? Has it also been on the gas side? Is there still more opportunity there? Or do you have the information you need? Is the analysis around to help kind of take that a step further if the opportunity exists?
Well, I can speak a little bit about what Massachusetts has done. I'm not sure I know as well about the other states, but indeed we do have a gas energy efficiency program. And our energy efficiency program is focused with a change in our statute to allow for energy efficiency programs for fuel switching, so that we would be reducing the amount of gas that is being used in the residential sector, which could help the winter problem because of having less people using gas in the winter in their homes.
Thanks. And the other area I wanted to cover on the supply side, I'm sorry, Mr. Dickerson, go ahead.
Okay. So I think holistically, this panel, we're talking about winter, gas and electric. We're also talking about, as several of the commissioners pointed out, policies. And these aren't indictments. These are just the facts of where we are. Policies that are basically driving away the use of hydrocarbons. So for people in New England who are currently heating their homes with natural gas or oil, their policy pushes to stop that. What do you replace that with? Heat pumps. When it's 16 degrees outside, heat pumps are purely resistive heaters. They are the antithesis of energy efficiency. They drive cost up. In addition, what my presentation showed, and not by numbers, but just directionally, I think someone said we don't have to go beyond page 3 of the paper to see it. There's a strong forecast for increased electric vehicles. they're going to use electricity. So even if people are reducing demand, you would have to overlay that with a big pie, and I don't have a number of how much energy they're going to use charging electric vehicles. And the last thing, and again, I say this with respect because I want us to kind of at least just get aligned with what the realities, the physics are. When it's 16 degrees outside, there's only so much reduction you can do in demand. People don't want to be cold.
Absolutely.
I was on CSNBC years ago when I ran a gas company, and I made the unfortunate mistake of telling people to put sweaters on. My family killed me. They called me. There's not enough sweaters you can put on when it's 16 degrees outside. There's not enough reduction you can do with gas, and if you don't have gas because you're not promoting it and you have heat pumps, you just can't do it. We need to think holistically. I'm not saying that those things don't have value, but they're not going to be the levers that we need holistically, particularly when we're talking about usage in the winter.
Thanks. I'm absolutely thinking holistically. I'm just trying to ask the questions. The other, and it's a great transition into my next question, which is on the supply side, the fact that we don't necessarily have incentives in place through the existing market design to get performance in these times of shortage, or to ensure that we can do other things in advance to plan so that in the market time frame there is performance. So, Mr. Caslow, I'll take advantage of your 25 years of experience on this front and see, do you have a perspective? Should we be thinking about other deficiencies that we could be thinking about on the market design side, capacity accreditation, otherwise related to energy adequacy that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, in fact, there's two that come to mind in particular, and one falls out of the ISO's presentation. And I don't blame the system operator for not even wanting to get close to having a problem. But when they have the close events type of terminology that often is discussed in terms of the winter, the close calls were close calls to becoming reserve deficient. Keep in mind that the only performance incentive that we have in the capacity market currently is the pay for performance mechanism. That relies on hitting scarcity events. If getting worried about coming close to a scarcity event is part of the concern, I have a concern that we just don't have a signal that's going to be sent out there to drive the right decision. So that's point number one. Point number two is, if the real problem is that we have more gas generating capability to transform BTUs into electricity than we have the BTUs to supply them in these peak winter days in the winter, why are we paying them the same payment as the megawatt that does have fuel? And our current accreditation does that. So we have some things to fix, and those are probably not the only features that need to be addressed, hence my agreement with your earlier comment that we really need to understand the full scope of the problem here.
Just wanted to briefly respond to Tom's comment about the close calls and that they were focused on capacity deficiencies or only limited to that. I think the 17-18 experience was beyond just a capacity deficiency. We were in that, we were close to an actual energy emergency in that state. And, one of the things that we learned from that event, and maybe this isn't the best mechanism from a market perspective, but what we learned was that we didn't have a good way to communicate to the region when we were close to a condition like that. What we wanted to have happen was we wanted to have generators go out and get fuel and replenish, and we wanted LNG to come to the region, but we had no way of saying that. So what we put in place and what we have today is our 21-day energy assessment and forecast that looks out over a 3-week period that is intended to inform the region of when we're close to energy deficiency conditions like that, so that there is some understanding, so that there is some incentive to go out and get the fuel that is needed. And I just wanted to make that clarification.
And just one question, does the winter kind of shortage impacts get captured in existing capacity accreditation?
So the question is,
in current
is the
market design?
potential for energy shortages captured in the existing
Or
resource.
for lack of fuel assurance, yeah.
I believe that's one of the, and I'm not the market expert, so I'll caveat my response with that, but the ongoing enhancements to the capacity accreditation process, my understanding is that they're intended to capture that reality, right? So that the capacity assigned to resources in the region better reflects their ability to get the fuel that they need to perform.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Commissioner Clements. We're going to run over this panel a bit, but to allow everyone to ask questions. So, Commissioner Christie?
I don't have any questions.
Okay, thanks.
I do. I have a lot of questions, but I'm not going to take up everybody's time.
Commissioner Phillips?
Commissioner Christie just put pressure on me not to ask questions. I will do us all a favor, and I'll just sort of put out there sort of what's on my mind. Mr. Dickerson, you actually mentioned gas-electric coordination. That's something I'm interested in. I can talk to you offline about that, whether or not, what are the activities that are going on, whether we need to do more on that point. Ms. Tepper, I want to thank you for your colloquy with my colleague, Commissioner Danley, about demand response. I had a question about that. You largely addressed what I was thinking there. And I'll stop right there. I had other things to say, but I'll subject other panelists to my questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Phillips. Ms. Tepper, did you have something you want to say before we?
I guess I was just going to say that the region has been doing quite a bit, and so I didn't want to leave with the impression that we aren't doing anything here. I mean, we are looking at capacity accreditation. We are looking at a day-ahead ancillary service market. We've got the inventory energy program coming on board. So I do think we are a region that traditionally has been able to work together to solve problems, and I think we are getting there. And one last thing, which is I would encourage you all, as you have done with the states, to make sure that we are bringing lots of people into this discussion and thinking broadly about who's interested in these issues. Talking to the public about reliability, affordability, and the climate is necessary to have them part as the problem solving, so that we can have buy-in and so that we can hear from many voices and get to the best answers.
Well, thank you, Ms. Tepper. We definitely will follow that advice. Mr. Dickerson?
Yes, I just wanted to say to Commissioner Clements, I did not mean to suggest at all that you weren't thinking about it holistically. I was speaking more broadly, so I just wanted to make that clear, Commissioner. Yes.
So we're going to take a break for 10 minutes and come back at 10:45. I want to thank the panelists for participating. Really appreciate your participation today.